Some actors don't respond to films the way audiences expect them to. Their reactions aren't about surprise or spectacle. They're about intention, about whether a story understands itself. Timothée Chalamet has always spoken about art as something that should feel deliberate rather than loud, emotionally precise rather than overwhelming. So when Moana 2026 entered the conversation around him, the interest wasn't in whether he liked it. The interest was in what he noticed. What stood out immediately was not scale, mythology, or franchise weight. It was growth. He spoke briefly about how the story felt older without feeling heavier, more confident without needing to announce that confidence. There was a sense, in his words, that the film trusted its own rhythm, that it didn't rush toward moments meant to impress, but allowed its emotional spine to stay visible throughout. He described it simply as measured, a word that carries far more weight than it sounds. That idea became central to his reaction. Moana 2026, in his view, doesn't try to recreate wonder by repetition. It assumes the audience already understands the world and chooses instead to explore what comes after self-discovery. The film feels less concerned with proving its identity and more focused on honoring it. That restraint, he implied, is where its ambition really lives. He touched on how rare it is for a continuation to resist excess. Instead of expanding outward endlessly, the story folds inward. The emotional questions are more personal, more specific, and therefore more universal. He noted that the film allows silence, metaphor, and emotional consequence to coexist without explanation. That choice, he suggested, shows trust, not just in the audience, but in the characters themselves. There was a moment where he referred to the film as confident enough to let things sit. It wasn't framed as praise in the traditional sense, it was observation. Moana 2026 doesn't rush past emotional beats to reach the next turning point. It allows the weight of responsibility, leadership, and self-doubt to remain unresolved longer than expected. According to him, that patience changes how the story lands. What he seemed most engaged by was how the film treats growth not as transformation, but as continuation. Moana is not relearning who she is. She's learning how to carry who she is forward. That distinction matters. It shifts the film away from spectacle-driven arcs and into something more reflective. Chalamet suggested that this is where the emotional maturity of the story quietly reveals itself. He didn't frame the film as darker or heavier. Instead, he spoke about emotional density. The joy is still present, but it's layered with responsibility. The wonder hasn't disappeared, it's evolved. That balance, he implied, is difficult to achieve without losing tone. Moana 2026 manages it by staying grounded in character rather than concept. When the conversation moved toward performance, his tone didn't change, but his focus sharpened. Dwayne Johnson's presence was addressed not as novelty or energy alone, but as consistency. Chalamet acknowledged the discipline required to return to a character without reducing it to familiarity. There's an understanding, he noted, that energy doesn't mean volume, it means commitment. Johnson's performance carries a steadiness that anchors the larger world around him, allowing the story's emotional shifts to feel earned rather than exaggerated. He spoke about that kind of reliability with respect. Returning to a role like this, especially one so culturally visible, comes with responsibility. The work isn't about reinvention for attention, it's about preservation with purpose. Johnson's approach, as he observed it, reflects that awareness. The character doesn't compete with the story, it supports it. Catherine Lagaaya's performance was discussed with similar care, though from a different angle. Chalamet pointed out the weight that comes with stepping into a role shaped by expectation, legacy, and cultural resonance. What impressed him wasn't boldness, but grounding. Her work feels rooted, attentive, and intentional. There's a sense that she understands the responsibility of presence, not just performance. He described her approach as listening before leading, a phrase that speaks volumes about how the character evolves. The performance doesn't ask the audience to follow, it invites them to observe. That restraint creates trust. It allows the character's authority to feel earned rather than declared. In a story about leadership and growth, that distinction carries quiet power. Across the cast, what he seemed to recognize was effort that doesn't seek validation. The performances feel disciplined, not performative. There's respect for the material, for the world, and for the audience's intelligence. Moana 2026 doesn't rely on emotional shortcuts, and the cast doesn't rely on familiarity to carry weight. That alignment, he suggested, is rare. As the commentary circled back to the film itself, one idea remained consistent. Ambition doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it shows up as restraint, as choosing clarity over noise, as trusting the audience to feel rather than be told. Chalamet's reaction wasn't about surprise twists or standout moments. It was about coherence, about a story that knows exactly what it wants to say and says it without excess. Why does that reaction matter? Because it comes from someone who consistently gravitates toward intention-driven storytelling, someone attuned to tone, structure, and emotional honesty. When that perspective engages with a film like Moana 2026, it reframes expectations, not toward spectacle, but the substance. The conversation around the film shifts subtly after that. The anticipation becomes quieter, more focused, less about what will happen and more about how it will feel to sit with the story once it's over. If Moana 2026 truly reflects the confidence, restraint, and emotional maturity that stood out here, then the real question isn't whether it will impress, but whether it will stay with us longer than we expect.